have analogies that are easily detected. But the full story of India's independence would not be complete without another part of the story, and one that Americans, on the surface at least, would find very hard to find an analogy for in our own history. And that, of course, is the story of partition. It's well known here that freedom at midnight meant mass migration across the rather hastily drawn borders of India and Pakistan. A migration of some 15 million people, an estimate, multiplied cities like Delhi, the population of Delhi, overnight, fourfold. Also well known is the slaughter of those, the mass killings of those who were caught on the wrong sides of the line at the time of partition. And Time magazine, for example, devoted a cover story to India's partition in 1947 with the slogan, the headline, so to speak, of the cover reading, "Liberty and Death," twisting that American revolutionary slogan, liberty or death. Now, if you ask any American, they'll tell you that we had nothing remotely like this in the United States. They'll see no parallel at all between the experience of partition and the mass migration, and of course the mass killing that went with it, and the story of American national independence. They will not relate to the images of millions of people so amazingly captured by photographers like Margaret Bourke-White, the images of millions on the trains crossing back and forth across borders to live somewhere where they felt safe. But for all that Americans don't by and large associate with this kind of story, for all that it seems completely outside our national experience, we did have a parallel of a sort. A mass migration of people from the new United States who did not think that the United States would provide for them a safe haven. These people were loyalists, people who remained loyal to the British Empire during the struggle for independence in the United States, and they were a lot more numerous than most Americans understand. In fact, at the time of the American Revolution, fully 1 in 3 members of the colonial population was loyal to Britain. Another 1 in 3 was undecided about what position they would take in this conflict. And so what that means is that at the time of the American Revolution, the summit of the struggle for independence, one could say, the majority of the American colonial population was either undecided or against the revolution. So we have a very different kind of sort of social background to the independence struggle to what you may have in India, and above all, very different from what the nationalist images of this episode would tend to tell Americans today. At the end of the American Revolution, what's more, out of this large population of loyalists, tens of thousands chose to leave the United States and find new homes elsewhere in the British Empire, rather than accept this new supposed beacon of liberty and hope for the world. For them, the promises of the American Revolution to bring life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all a phrase in the Declaration of Independence of 1776. For them, those promises did not seem to be best borne out in the United States. Rather, for them, it was the British Empire that held the best hope for this future. In the United States, they saw instead a climate of violence, one in which minorities might be squashed by the tyranny of the majority, one with poor prospects for prosperity economically, with poor prospects for peace. To them, it was the British Empire and King George III who promised protection and a better life. My most recent book, Liberty's Exiles, is the first book to tell the story of all of these loyalists who set out into the British Empire. And it's a story that, as perhaps you can already tell, is one that is so at odds with American nationalist narratives that it had not been told in full before. And in it, what I do is trace the lives of some of the 75,000 Americans who set out from the new nation to find new lives in the British Empire. 75,000 people at that time represented some 1 in 40 members of the American population. Now, this scale, of course, will seem small in relation to the movements accompanying partition in the 20th century when global populations are much higher. But we need to remember this is a time when the population of the United States is 2.5, 3 million. So the migration of 75,000 people, 1 in 40 members, is quite a significant movement. It's by far the largest migration of civilians out of the United States at any time in our history. Now, it can be difficult for us, I think, today to understand why anyone would do this, why anyone would prefer rule by an empire to remaining a citizen of a democratic republic. But I think that for all that we may not understand why these people did what they did, it's nonetheless very important for us to try. Because by looking at why people didn't want to participate in this democratic republic, we can come to a fuller understanding of what democracy does and does not provide. And that's a point that I'd like to return to at the end. The American Revolution was the first war of independence in the British Empire. It was a successful war inasmuch as it yielded independence for the United States. And it also had a profound effect on the nature of British rule elsewhere in the empire, the rest of the empire that endured. And that's the second point that I'd like to return to at the end, that the American Revolution has direct ramifications for what happens in India under the British and raises questions about what happens in India as a democracy, just as it raises questions about the United States as a democracy in turn. So who were these loyalists and what was their story? Well, America on the eve of the Revolution in the mid-18th century was a dynamic, rapidly growing place, a site of significant immigration from Britain, the British Isles, moving into the vast territory that existed along what is now the eastern seaboard of the United States. Britain had a string of colonies in the Americas, ranging from Nova Scotia in present-day Canada, all the way down into the Caribbean, where they had a number of islands known for producing sugar. These were actually the most economically important colonies in the British Empire at this time. Out of the 26 colonies that Britain had in the Americas, 13 were strung along the east coast of the United States, present-day Georgia up to Maine, for those of you who know the territory. These 13 colonies were, as I've mentioned, growing very fast in terms of population. Their economy was growing as well, particularly strong in trade across the Atlantic. Because of this trade, there was those who profited from the trade became increasingly resentful of the taxation system of the British Empire. And so one of the grievances that colonists increasingly held against the British had to do with taxes. Another great asset of the American colonies, and another reason they were growing very fast at this time, but also another site of grievance, had to do with land. Now, the east coast of America today, the east coast of the United States, is really just a narrow band on what is a continental nation that extends all the way out to the Pacific. In the 18th century, the mid part of the 18th century, the sense of the West, this huge expanse of land, was incredibly enticing to colonists who wished to go to North America and scope out territorial claims for themselves. The British, however, understood that this land, ranging across the continent, was land that was, first of all, possessed by others already. It was possessed by the indigenous peoples of North America, the Native Americans, or Indians, as we call them in the US. And it was also a site of colonial competition, because the French, the Spanish, other empires had their eye on this terrain. So the British authorities decided to draw a line across North America, saying you can't settle beyond this line, it's going to create all kinds of problems for us. And this became another source of grievance by colonists against the British Empire. The final point to make about the colonies on the eve of the Revolution had to do with what they were producing. They had rich agricultural lands, and those lands, particularly in the South, were worked overwhelmingly by slaves. Out of the 2.5 million people resident in the 13 colonies on the eve of the American Revolution, 500,000, 1 in 5, were enslaved Africans who had been brought to the colonies from Africa to work as slaves. Now, in the 1770s, abolitionist sentiment was already starting to rise in Britain. And the American planters who had an investment in retaining their slaves were somewhat at odds with what they saw as a system that was increasingly perhaps more liberal toward the treatment of slaves than they themselves. So patriots, by and large, wanted freedom to trade without taxes. They wanted access to land. They wanted the paradoxical fact of freedom without slaves. And these impulses help you get a sense, perhaps, of why some others in the colonies chose to remain loyal, by contrast. Who might remain loyal? Well, fundamentally, people who thought the king was a better guarantor of their interests. So who might this include? It might include people who didn't resent the taxes, people who benefited from the taxes, people who helped collect the taxes, in fact, British government employees. It might include those who belonged, indeed were ministers in, the Church of England, headed by the king, an institution with considerable reach in North America. It might include a range of everyday citizens who believed that the economic potential of the British Empire was a better way for them to go than striking out on their own in an unknown future. And it might also include two populations in particular, the Native Americans, who saw American colonists as basically wanting to grab their land and kill them, but saw the British Empire as protecting their interests, and also American-owned slaves, who saw in the British Empire, and soon had very specific reason to see in the British Empire, a slightly better system of administration than they were getting from their patriot planter owners. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired in 1775. And the situation for those who remained loyal, who remained kind of pro-British Empire, changed very rapidly from this point onward. One new state after another imposed laws against loyalists, laws that might banish them, imprison them, confiscate their property. And on the heels of these laws also came violence, because this was a war. There was a good deal of mob violence that accompanied it. Loyalists found themselves on the receiving end of mob violence that could land them in being assaulted in their own homes, most famously being tarred and feathered, a quite brutal process where people were doused in scalding tar, pitch, and then rolled in feathers. The tar would generally flay them, and they would be scalded. I've read accounts of several people who lost their toes and so on in these kinds of episodes. The violence of the American Revolution, which tends to get underplayed in our nationalist narratives of this, impelled tens of thousands of loyalists to go seek shelter in different parts of the colonies where they thought they might be safe. These were cities that were occupied by British troops, cities like New York City, which was held by the British throughout most of the American Revolution, cities in the southern part of the future United States, Charleston and Savannah, and in these strongholds they tried to stay safe, surrounded by British troops for the duration of the war. Well, the British ultimately failed to protect the loyalists because ultimately they failed to win the war. In 1781, the general of the British Army in North America, Lord Cornwallis, a name that may be familiar to some of you in India that I'll return to also at the end. Lord Cornwallis surrendered the British Army to George Washington, the the victorious leader of the American Continental Army. In 1781, he surrendered, and in 1783, Britain recognized U.S. independence, and the American Revolution was formally over. With this, British troops pulled out, and all of those loyalist civilians were left hanging. What was going to happen to them? Here they were, chased off their territory in some cases, on the wrong side of a war, the losers. The troops that had protected them had left. The institutions that were coming into place were completely questionable and unknown to them. Would there be laws against them, as there already had been? Would there be destruction of their property, as there already had been? Would there be violence, physical violence against them, as there already had been in the United States? Left hanging with these questions, the Loyalists had another alternative to look to. What about leaving? Come with us, said the British, as they were pulling out. You can get on our ships for free, and we'll take you somewhere else. We'll take you, we weren't able to protect you here, but we'll take you somewhere else. We can take you to Canada. We can take you to the Caribbean, those other colonies in the Americas that never rebelled. We can even take you to Britain, and maybe we can take you to other parts of the empire. And when we take you, we're not just going to give you a ride on the boat. We're going to give you some provisions to keep you going, because, hey, you know, it's like coming to Jaipur with the wrong clothes. You might be really cold if you go to Canada and you're from the south and you don't have the right clothes. We'll give you army surplus blankets to keep you warm. We'll give you tools so that you can plow your new fields and whatever you find in the new places you go. And speaking of new fields, we'll give you some land as well. We can give you land in Canada. There's a lot there. We can give you land in the Bahamas, for example. There's a lot of land there. Come with us, and we will give you these things. And for formerly enslaved Americans, the British had another promise of a particularly meaningful kind. Come with us, they said. If you fought with us in the war, come with us, and we will give you freedom. And with these promises, the British evacuated some 75,000 people from the United States, of whom 8,000 to 10,000 were freed African Americans, former slaves, who followed the British promises of freedom into the British Empire. Where did these people go, and what did they find? Well, the way that I chose to characterize the history of these people, you know, it's a migration of 75,000 individuals. There's no way that a single book can ever capture the lives and experiences of 75,000. There's no way a single historian can come close to excavating the experiences of all of these people. So what I tried to do in my research, which took me to every place that the Loyalists themselves ended up, was what I did was I pieced together the records that they left in all of these different locations to try to find some individual lives that I thought were illustrative of the larger patterns that governed this mass exodus. So let me tell you, I think I have time to tell you the stories of a couple of these people, which I hope will give you a flavor of the kinds of experiences that they had as refugees adrift in the British Empire. One of the people that I focused on quite early was a woman who, in a sense, told me that there was a story here. She was a woman named Elizabeth Lichtenstein Johnston, and she wrote a memoir about her experiences in the 19th century, in the 1840s, in which she set down her experiences of the revolution from earlier in her life. And it was in reading her memoir that I really realized there was a story here that needed to be told. Elizabeth Johnston was born in 1764, which meant that she was a girl when the American Revolution started. Her mother had died, she was an only child, she was 11 or 12 years old, one day in 1776 when patriots came to her father's house. She was living in Georgia, in the American South. Her father was a planter. He had not gone over to the patriot cause, and they were coming to get him. A mob marched toward the house. Her father, who had no interest in joining the rebellion, managed to slip out the back, literally jump out a window, basically, and go off in a little skiff down the back canals into safety with British troops, leaving his only child, with no mother, alone in the house. She ended up spending her late girlhood, her adolescence, growing up in war-torn Georgia in the American South, basically being shunted from one distant relative to another, from one family friend to another, while her father went off and fought with British troops against the Americans in other parts of the war zone. Father and daughter were reunited some years later. In the late 1770s, he came back to Savannah where she was. He had left her a girl. He came back to find her a young woman who was, in fact, prone to things like developing a romantic interest in completely unsuitable men, such as, in particular, one of his brother officers, a young officer who was known as what she described as a dashing fashionable of British-occupied New York, a gambler, a flirt, a rake, exactly the kind of person she was drawn to and that her father didn't want her to marry, but he had to give in. This was young William Johnston, to whom Elizabeth was married in war-torn Savannah in 1779. Well, this newlywed couple, Elizabeth is now 15, 16 years old. This newlywed couple ends up having not much of a honeymoon because their marriage, the early years of their marriage, basically unfold against the backdrop of a series of losing campaigns by the British through the American South. And with these losses and the ultimate surrender of the British troops, the Johnstons find themselves evacuating from one site of former British power to another. So Elizabeth Johnston finds herself in her native city of Savannah. In the early 1780s, she's pregnant with her first child. The British troops are pulling out. She has her first child. She goes with a babe in arms to Charleston, where the British still are. Well, soon Charleston is evacuated too. She stays there long enough to have another child and goes with two babes in arms, following the British again to another place where the troops are going. This is St. Augustine in Florida. Florida is a great place to stay if you can. Lots of British go there today. In fact, when I was doing my research, I should thank Google, one of the sponsors of this event. I would Google, everything to see what came up, and I Googled British Florida because Florida was a British colony in the 1770s and 80s. And guess what? There's a website for the British Florida Association today for all of the Brits who have retired to Florida and own land there right now. Well, in the 1780s, Britain was a very attractive, Florida was a very attractive destination to people as well, because it was not only warm, but it had lots of land. And so for people like the Johnstons, coming from a plantation culture, having access to lots of land with a climate that was familiar to them, they could bring their slaves, they could set up shop, everything would be great. So here's Elizabeth Johnston, newlywed-ish, 2 kids, has a third in St. Augustine when some more news arrives. Britain, it turns out, is not going to retain control of Florida in the peace treaty. It's actually going to hand Florida over in one of these kind of diplomatic swaps that characterizes imperial politics at this time. It's going to hand Florida over to Spain. And thus, all of these refugees who've come to Florida thinking it's going to be their home have to think about leaving again. And so Elizabeth Johnston sets off on yet another migration. This time, one that follows the trail of her husband's pre-war life. Before the war, William Johnston had been a medical student, and he decided to continue his training as a doctor. Well, where was he going to do that? In the 1780s, the best place to do your medical training was not Harvard Medical School. It was, in fact, Edinburgh in Scotland. And so the Johnston family, now with 3 kids, sets off across the Atlantic for yet another migration in the service of staying in the British Empire and finding a new life. In Edinburgh, the Johnstons have their first real family home. William, Johnston, Elizabeth are together in the same house. Their kids are together with them. They have another kid there. But at the same time, they find themselves in what becomes a very common predicament across the diaspora of loyalist refugees. And that is that for all that these people remained loyal to Britain, the king, the empire, they themselves were not British really at all. They were American colonists. And Britain to them was a foreign country. It was a place where they had no friends. It was a place where they hated the climate. It was a place where they had few job prospects because it all went by connections and so on. It was a place where, for families like the Johnstons, who had been rather affluent back in the colonies, they were relatively poor. And it was ultimately quite cold in all senses of the word. And Elizabeth Johnston finds herself in this funny position of going to the mother country and not feeling at home, compounded by a very personal loss when one of her children dies of thrush in Scotland, and she ends up planting her first gravestone along the trail that marks her migration. William Johnston finishes his medical training in Scotland, and then they face another question. Well, the best medical school is there, but that also means there's a lot of graduates from that medical school there. Where are they going to work? There's kind of a surfeit of doctors in Edinburgh, and so they need to find other places to practice their trade. William Johnston, as an immigrant, does not have the kind of network of connections that might help him get a good position somewhere else in Scotland or the British Isles. Instead, the connections that he has are ex-military from his time in the military service. And his former officers have themselves gone off to other parts of the British Empire. And so he takes a job offer from one of his contacts who has moved on. The job offer takes him to Jamaica, where he ends up being a doctor to, among other people, the governor, newly appointed governor of Jamaica. Once again across the Atlantic, the family goes with little money, with no idea of what they're going to find when they arrive there, with a bevy of babies in tow, Elizabeth Johnston cut off from all of the world that she had ever known. They arrive in Jamaica, a beautiful island, the richest colony in the British Empire at this time, a place whose wealth is so great that people go, like William Johnston, assuming that they can get rich quick and come away and lead a wonderful life somewhere else. But an island, too, that's full of challenges, because all of that wealth in Jamaica comes from the sugar plantations, which are themselves worked by millions of slaves. A ratio of black to white on Jamaica of about 10 to 1, which means that the white population, of which the Johnstons are now part, lives in this kind of bubble, but a bubble of terror, because they're constantly afraid that their slaves are going to turn against them. And so they create this incredibly violent sort of reign of terror in Jamaica, in which the slightest infringement by slaves is brutally punished. And there's a kind of climate of violence that permeates this island, with very few whites, even fewer white women. Elizabeth Johnston is almost alone as a white woman on Jamaica. And Jamaica's beauty also holds another danger, because this island, which is so beautiful, is beautiful partly because it's tropical, and because it's tropical, it has a lot of diseases that are unfamiliar to people coming from the more northerly parts of North America. Now, the diseases are great for William Johnston. He's a doctor, and this is why he has work in Jamaica. But they also are literally fatal for the white population, and indeed parts of the black population living in Jamaica at this time. Those diseases will turn fatally inward on the Johnston family. During their time in Jamaica, where Elizabeth is largely isolated as a white woman in this very difficult kind of environment. During their time in Jamaica, an infant dies of scarlet fever. Another infant who's born and named after the one who died also succumbs to smallpox. Their eldest son, who had been born in Savannah, dies of yellow fever. Their eldest daughter, who had been born in Charleston, becomes mentally ill. And Elizabeth Johnston, for her part, grows so depressed by her experiences, she says, having no friend or family to talk to, that she herself finds that she has to leave as well in search of some kind of mental peace. And so her next migration will be one that she undertakes voluntarily, leaving her husband, in this case, behind. She chooses to separate herself from her husband. I don't know what's going on in their marriage, don't ask me about that. But she chooses to separate herself from her husband in search of somewhere where she can feel safe. And the place that she ends up going is the place that many loyalists had gone to first. It is Halifax, Nova Scotia, north of the 13 colonies, a city that had remained loyal to the British Empire. And in Nova Scotia, at last, Elizabeth Johnston finds a community of fellow loyalist refugees who can embrace her, among whom she feels at home. She is no longer isolated. She's in a place where the diseases are not turning in on her. She's in a place, too, where her surviving children can join her and find careers and futures for themselves in this relatively recently settled colony that will serve them well. And ultimately, the Johnston family comes to Nova Scotia, all of them, and thrives, her children going on in subsequent generations to thrive in the British Empire. So what can we take from this story? Well, we can certainly take the fact that there is a lot of loss, personal loss, promises that are not entirely fulfilled, feelings of alienation. But we take, too, at the end, a victory of a sort, a victory of finding a home in the British Empire that is growing, that is expanding, that is full of opportunities, in which this family of refugees ends up achieving success. And this vignette, I think, points to a couple of larger points that I would like to raise, almost by way of questions, to invite a discussion that I hope will follow. Now, in the most literal sense, Britain lost the American Revolution. The United States became independent. This was the first successful independence movement in the British Empire, the biggest loss of territory until the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947. And yet, if you had to put a bet on which power was going to do better in the world in the 19th century, the US or the British Empire, you would be right to put your money on the British Empire. So how could the British Empire go from this loss to such gains? The loss in America prompted the British Empire to re-examine the nature of imperial rule, to recraft it in various ways, to become, in some ways, more liberal in its treatment of slaves, with the abolition of slavery relatively early in the 19th century, to become liberal-ish in its treatment of different kinds of ethnic minorities. But it also prompted the British Empire to become more authoritarian in some ways, more aggressively tied to crown rule, a presence that was felt, an influence that was felt in India, among other places. And all of this was played out, too, on an expanding global stage, because as Britain lost the colonies in the United States, it sought compensation elsewhere. It pursued a campaign of aggressive territorial expansion across South Asia. It expanded into West Africa, partly with loyalist support. It expanded into Australia. It expanded into Southeast Asia. And so it raises a couple of questions for us about the resonance of the American Revolution for the British Empire, and thus, in turn, for India. First, what would British rule in India have looked like without the American Revolution? And again, I think this is a sort of rhetorical question, but we could ask this and propose a few answers. It probably would have been less territorially extensive at least in the immediate short term. I'm not sure whether Britain would have turned to India as a source of manpower for the military to the same extent. British rule in India might have been less authoritarian. You might not have seen the supplanting of the East India Company or the regulation of the East India Company in quite the same way as soon. And I wonder too about the economic ramifications. Would Britain have turned to India as a marketplace for commodities as rapidly had it not lost the colonies in America? The second question that I think we can raise, and the one I'd like to end on, is how well have our democracies delivered on their promises? You know, for these patriotic anti-colonial activists in America and for India alike, the Declaration of Independence in the US insisted that all men are created equal and promised to deliver life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But manifestly in the United States, liberty did not come to the slaves. That had to wait till the Civil War, our version of partition. Democracy tries to deliver equality in law, but manifestly that does not always translate into practice. As Orwell would say, paraphrasing him, all men are created equal, but some are created more equal than others. And I think we can debate these questions, but what I really want to do is just raise the questions, not the answers, because the value of any of these kinds of histories is that it makes us look at issues from different sides. And so perhaps I can close with Lord Cornwallis, the man in America who is known as the Great Loser, a name you would never remember except with loss, and a man who is buried in India, in Ghazipur, whose tomb is a monument to a confident British Empire, a successful British Empire, a new kind of imperial rule whose legacies would be so significant on the other side of the world from the one in which he had lost 10 years later. So thank you very much, and I hope that we can discuss some of these ramifications.
Thank you very much for a characteristically brilliant lecture, managing, as all very accomplished historians do, and as the rest of us try to do, not only to take a broad perspective and raise some very broad questions that perhaps we'll discuss and begin to discuss in a moment, but also never to lose sight of the extraordinary individual stories. And you gave us a particularly resonant one in the case of Elizabeth Johnston. It's particularly interesting to see the American Revolution put in a different light. That's to say, not everybody thought it was a good idea at the time, and it's particularly interesting to see the British Empire put in a different light. That's to say, quite a few people thought it was a good idea at the time. And both of those points, of course, serve to remind us that the past contains many futures, and one of the things that what you've done helps us to realize is the many different alternatives and options that were available in the late 18th century that have been, as it were, forgotten in the light of subsequent events. So, I'm sure many of you have comments and questions that you would like to raise, and where shall we begin? I think there are roving microphones which will enable us to hear what you're saying, and we look forward to entertaining questions. Maya, why don't you field
the front row right here.
Familiar with your work, so would you please elaborate on your comment, similarities between the Civil War and the Indian Partition, please?
Sure. Well, you know, one of the things about the American Revolution that is obscured by the name, to say nothing of the legend that goes with the name, is that the American Revolution was really itself a civil war, in which obviously there were disputes between patriots and loyalists. One reason, however, that that civil war has been obscured is that in the case of America, so in essentially every case, I would venture to say, of anti-colonial independence movements, there is a civil war element that accompanies that independence movement. We did have it in the Revolution, but we had it in a far more vivid form a couple of generations later in the US Civil War, which I believe can be seen as something of an extension, a playing out of some of the paradoxes that emerged at the time of the Revolution, most notably and famously, of course, the question of slavery. And the US Civil War has gone down in national consciousness as the moment at which we were divided on this issue of slavery, but divided with these incredibly sort of intensely felt, widely experienced, and catastrophic consequences, in which families were divided, in which millions were slaughtered. The death toll of the American Civil War, vastly outstripped that of most other conflicts up to that point, and as remains to this day the bloodiest war in American history. So the U.S. Civil War, I think, resonates with Partition in the sense that, although it is not directly tied with the attainment of independence chronologically, I think it is related to the attainment of independence in as much as it connects to the nature of the state that was created after independence. It ties in with Partition, certainly in terms of the scale of loss and the scale of destruction that accompanied it. And it ties in above all with Partition, I think, in the complexity of the memories and the legacies that it's left behind. Because while, the US kind of celebrates the unity that was created in the wake of the Civil War, it's seen, by some as a war of slavery, it's seen by others as a war of secession, et cetera, but we're all in it, we're all together now. Nevertheless, these kinds of different images of the war and its resonance remain very, I think, active in the American imagination today. Oh, I'm to recognize? Well, how about here in the second row?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment and maybe something that you want to maybe extend on. When you said about the punishment, when you said about people being tarred and feathered, it immediately brings the parallel of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And of course, if you want to kind of link it to India, we know that so many civil servants went from Ireland to India, or came to India. Now, but also that the Australia was used as the colony where prisoners were sent, like political prisoners like John Mitchell. But do you know anything else about maybe that connection with India? If there were Irish people who were sent here as they were in Australia, just to close the triangle, if you like.
So I think your comment raises a couple of important points. I mean, one is the question of circulation of peoples around the empire. So, I mean, I mentioned Lord Cornwallis. He was, of course, British and in military service. You would, at one level, expect him to be circulating, but he's very important in that he's a policymaker whose images of how to run things are created in one place and applied in another. This is a model that will apply throughout British imperial history. You will consistently have, governors. Look at Curzon, for example, here in India, who had time previously in other parts of the empire. So that remains the case. You also have civilians who move around. So some of the loyalists end up actually coming to India. For those who know the history of the American Revolution in a little greater detail here, you may be familiar with the name Benedict Arnold, who has gone down in American history as the biggest traitor. He's sort of like the Mir Jafar of America. And two of his children actually ended up getting commissions that he worked hard to get them in the East India Company Army, came to India where they had BBs here, children here, etc., spent the rest of their lives here. So the circulation of people from one place to another is a constant in imperial history. One can spin it out into the history of Indian labor migration all around the world. The second point that I would follow up on here is the one about violence, which is something that you raise. And I think, the British are constantly turning to different parts of the empire to act as agents in the military oppression of others. And the East India Company Army, for example, had a huge constituency of Irish troops. This remained enormously strong well into the 19th century. And of course, ultimately, it was the Indian army, composed overwhelmingly of Indian troops, that the British would use to police, in particular, the Middle East, but to pursue all over the empire. So lots of links. There was the gentleman in the orange vest had his hand up.
Hi, thank you for this nice conversation. And I read your article from the ship, notes from ship in Al Jazeera English.
I'm sorry, I'm having...
The notes from the ship, the sea route journey you took from Taiwan to South Africa. And can you talk more about that also? And the second question was about the Elizabeth-Johnston connection and how you kind of studied the journey of women in those times and history of military expansion and imperialism, and from the point of view of a woman. So these two questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So, you know, one of the problems with writing any history is that you are working with the sources that happen to have been left behind by accident. And those sources tend to be preserved much more carefully when they're generated by states and institutions. And they tend to be created in the first place when they're generated, obviously, by literate people, by people with power and status of some kind. So overwhelmingly, the sources that we have most readily available to us are produced by men in institutional settings like the military. Well, needless to say, history affects all of us, and the histories of at least the histories of the majority of people are not recorded as explicitly in those kinds of documents as we might wish in order to recreate those histories. So to write about the history of women in this period, one can draw, of course, on the documents that survive, of which there are many, many fewer than there are for men, but one also has to be creative in the use of these kinds of documents. One has to perform what subaltern studies scholars here, of course, do, which is to read documents against the grain, that is, to look for things that perhaps their author wasn't trying to foreground, and one needs to look in unusual places for them in order to try to get into the mindset. And this links to the second question that you asked me about. So I recently, as David mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently writing a book about Joseph Conrad, the novelist of the late 19th, early 20th century. And in order to better understand his world, I felt that it was very important for me to try to experience something of the world that he experienced, because there were certain aspects of his world and experience that aren't captured in the kinds of documents that we have, in the kinds of novels that he wrote. And the best way that I could come up with in order to experience this, to gain access to that part of his oeuvre, was to replicate some of his travels myself. And so I ended up sailing on a container ship just last month from Hong Kong to Southampton via the Suez Canal, because I wanted to spend time at sea and try to understand what it was like to do that. So for the Loyalists, for example, I traveled to every place that they went to because I wanted to see it and at least try to imagine my way into places that the documents were only opening the door partway onto.
One last question, I think.
I want to try to get to a different part of the room. How about over there? Sure.
Thank you for sharing Elizabeth Boyden's story. It was terrific. I have a very quick question. I'm looking at the life of Leonard Woolf as a young civil servant in what was Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and he was impeccable. Everyone loved him. He did the best he could. Do you think that the British administration learned from their colonial past, perhaps the lessons of the American Civil War, to train people to have more cultural sensitivity over the people and colonies that they ruled? Thank you.
Well, I do think that, one sees all kinds of ways in which colonial administrators there were attempts to educate them about the places that they were going. a figure like Leonard Woolf, of course, is so extraordinary in his own right. I mean, you also end up having to think about who is attracted to these positions in the first place to take them, and are they curious and open-minded. But I think that the point that your comment raises for me that relates, I think, to this issue of what democracy brings is that, democracy manifestly in India and the United States does not bring freedom from corruption. And one of the things that people always say about the Indian civil service is that they were completely incorruptible. And I think it's quite interesting to think about how, some of the ways in which we see our rights as being restricted actually come also with some of the things that we would like to see represented in our existing state structures.
I fear that's all we have time for. This has been a wonderful session. I can say that because Maya in particular and you in general have done all the talking, not me. A huge number of interesting issues raised. We could go on for a great deal longer, but instead of doing that, just think that Maya will be back to talk about Joseph Conrad in a few years, but she can't come back unless we applaud her for being here now and having been so good.